they then were more than happy to support a town meeting because a large number of people understood what was going on.
And the local people right in there were the ones that were very much involved. If I remember, you really did change the zone after the people spoke. It was like,
oh yes,
two
we
properties
did. We listened. We
wound up
took,
changing.
yeah. Because after all, that particular zone had an impact on residential properties all around,
Yeah.
and we tinkered with uses that would be acceptable to the residents. So if we move forward with something here, you really have to do that same kind of discussion with the public and let people understand why we're doing it, you know, what would the impact be. But beyond that, everyone needs to understand that that zone is completely under the jurisdiction of the Historical Commission. That they control, no building permit can be issued without a certificate of appropriateness or of applicability from the Historical Commission. So we're talking about a district that has another level, you know, of jurisdiction and control. And I think we should hear from the Historical Commission as to how they feel about this.
I have to come up there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just
Please, please. It's an open chair.
Grab a chair.
There's a chair right here.
Is this one all right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Martha, she basically said it. I mean, the town voted in 1974 to create a local historic district, which has the highest level of control over an area. And that was a 2/3 majority of the town voted on that. And 2 years later, in '76, it became a national registered historic district. So our job for however many years that is, 40+ years, has been to keep the common area looking as great as it does. So clearly we're a little bit nervous about this. Would need to see the language, would need to understand that we would still have a lot of say over any changes that had to do with the building fabric. On the facades of these houses, anything seen from the public ways, we have the call on. So that's really the gist of it at this point.
Liz, I have a question. I think loud and clear, I don't think anybody wants to see the common change in terms of the feeling, the look, the sense, the aesthetic,
right,
and so on. The question is whether a use within that was, you know, an historically appropriate door and so on, and the appropriate signage, all the things we talk about. Does the Historic Commission take a position or have any control over what might happen inside the facade? So one of the questions, and I've certainly been assuming that it is kind of part and parcel with any plan to move forward in this, is doing a great job, and this may take time, more than we can do before this coming town meeting. But to be sure that the language does protect the aesthetic that we see right now, and that whatever guidelines and abilities, you know, there were any changes to the rules that you have right now, and ideally would not have to be changed, but they would have to be loosened in a matter of maintaining that level of overlay control while allowing some different functions. And the question then is if there were twinkly lights on the inside and the door that people were going in, and parking that was not offensive, but there's great food served inside, and you could get a drink, a glass of wine and a cocktail.
And they serve goat cheese, perhaps.
And they might serve goat cheese. No lamb. So the key is whether there might be conceptually, we don't have the specifics, conceptually, is there kind of a sense that we could, maybe it's a much more careful set of steps than I might have imagined in my simple view, that we could move forward and think about how we might do that as a way to preserve. Because from my point of view, if we could put a restaurant up at this end, I think of a restaurant above all, first of all, it's a magical place. And if it looked like it does, that's part of the magic. You know, my dream, I always say, we don't need a restaurant in Topsfield and all, you know, an evening full serve, full pour licensed restaurant. We need at least two. And there has to be at least another one someplace else in an ideal world, you know, probably a third. And I think then we reach the critical mass of, oh, you can come to Topsfield, and if this place is busy, you can go there, kind of a thing, or you can come visit several times and not see it again. This now is just a discussion about this, and at this moment, Frank Martino's made no commitments. We have had people who have talked and said, not knowing we have liquor licenses. And by the way, we've been told by the one of the economic development people in Massachusetts that we're probably the only town that doesn't have any full-serve restaurants, but has licenses that are ready to go.
Well,
It's
Frank,
always the other way around.
if it was just Frank, that's easy, because he's essentially there, he's already set up to be a restaurant. It just has to do with being zoned to allow it. It would be,
Exactly.
the risk is that then the Lopez house or another house could then have that same right, and then, but they're gonna require a lot of other physical changes to make that legal from, the rules that the code issues,
Yeah.
handicap access, and great, all those kinds of things.
Expensive.
Expensive, and would dramatically affect some of those houses in terms of their appearances from the street.
Well, I think that that's the question, and we don't know at this point. I think someone mentioned the Hart House as an example of an historic building that has been converted successfully, and maybe under different sets of rules than we would have here. But yeah, there are issues with exhaust vents and so on and so forth, and hidden from the street.
Right, so all
kinds
those
of
things
questions. I
are,
don't know.
with plenty of money, you can make everything look pretty good, right?
Yeah.
But you don't want to invite somebody in thinking that they can do something, and then the expenses of doing it in a way that keep the historical integrity then become a financial hardship, and it puts the Historic Commission in this difficult position. So the process that you would approve something, I would really need to understand that, so that it's always buyer beware, that they're gonna get into something where it's gonna have a high standard.
I think it would take a very particular kind of investor who would choose to do that, but would probably specifically be interested in trying to do sort of a wayside inn kind of a thing, or a hard house kind of a thing, because that's all we're going to offer here on Concord, in Concord and so on. So, but I think we could manage that. Part of that is job of the select board and others to market what we have. This is a very special area, but there's room for a very special opportunity for somebody who does have money. As we all know, there are some folks who have money and are less concerned about trying to maximize their profit than they are to make a contribution to an area and have it break even and be proud of what they've built. So obviously those are the folks we need.
We have people who have done that downtown already.
Yeah.
And are willing to make the investment. The relationship between the Historical Commission's rules and regulations and how they go about dealing with applicability and zoning is a little bit, a little bit dicey. If we're doing a sign bylaw, we would want the Historical Commission to actually talk about what they would allow in the way of signs on the ground, because they have control over everything that's vertical, We, however, the zoning cannot govern materials and colors and all of that. That's something that the Historical Commission comes under. So we're looking at, two levels of permitting. One that allows the permitting authority to rule on what kind of materials, colors, all of that sort of thing. And then the other that is a density and dimensional and uses that I think we're talking about a very few uses. We're talking about restaurant, offices. We already have guest house, by special permit. We have some other, those sort of lodging house, boarding house, whatever, by special permit. So what other uses would we be talking about? Is it just restaurants and offices?
I don't think we've even gotten to the point of talking about all of the uses that could be put in play. The restaurant keeps coming up, and that's because we've got people from outside of town telling us you ought to have a restaurant in town.
Well, I think a good starting point, and I've already started looking, I'm sure everyone else should do it too, to go to the table of uses in our zoning bylaw and go down through the list. What is allowed currently, or what is allowed in other commercial districts? What would we think would be appropriate to be allowed in a Topsfield Town Common District? And I think as you go through, you can start imagining, well, I don't think we want a barber shop down there. I don't know that we want
Another bank.
another bank. I don't think we want, you know, when you start thinking about what we already have lots of, and that would perhaps not be, you know, really great, you know, in the district. But again, this is gonna take some time, you know, for people to go through and take a look at all of that.
How long did it take last time, Ralph?
What,
For the creation of the Business North?
We spent, there was a committee looking at it for about a year. Then we got started and said, okay, so we looked at it for about a year.
Was that a subcommittee of the planning?
You know, it was a subcommittee and a, you know, kind of planning group. And then we started early in the fall and started the process that I've described. Right? And just to remind you, it's absolutely critical that when any major zoning change like this goes to town meeting, that people not be blindsided, that they really need to have an appreciation for what this is all about, what it's going to accomplish, how the district is going to be protected. I think that's very, very important. It's always a disaster to go rushing to town meeting with some, oh, here, we're going to make a change, and then the whole thing falls apart in town meeting floor.
A few questions, private point.
Yeah, a couple of questions and the whole thing.
One of the things that I thought was particularly helpful, what you said is, and we're talking about the common at this point, we have a very specific person who's interested in something, Frank Martino, and I thought that was an excellent example. We know that the number of properties we're talking about is very limited for. My suggestion is we go to Frank, first of all, and have him flesh out what it would be, because this represents kind of like the vision. Is somebody saying, at another building, I'd like to do offices? Okay, well, let's think about, you know, the offices. How would you do that? Why would you do that? What would be the issues? And try to get that sort of visioning down from the individual. This is not a big deal. Again, for property. We're not going to use the town hall for a restaurant. We're not going to use the library for a restaurant. Dr. School's not going to be a restaurant. It's not going to be a boarding house. The church is not going to be a
Not in our lifetimes.
So the Gould Barn is not, well, the Gould Barn uses a lot of things, but it's not going to.
A restaurant will need a lot of parking also.
Yeah.
Yep.
The point is that there's a limited number of properties. I would say that very helpful for us, if we're interested in this, to be able to talk to the people, get some flesh out of what that is for visions. They don't have to have one solution. Well, I'd like to do this or this, but I could also do this or this. That's okay. But out of those properties, find out what they would do and how they would do it. I think that would be very helpful to everybody.
Could you add restaurant capability by special permit in the district that's already, it's already what is
They
it?
would then open it up for special permit for the entire central residential.
Is that a bad
district.
thing?
I don't know the residents of the central residential district would be thrilled to have the possibility that a restaurant.
They wouldn't do it, they worry about the neighbors.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
get
So,
a full serve restaurant, and then you have the alcohol issues and
But
everything.
don't all these properties have to have all these other conditions that would have to be allowed for that kind of use anyway, whether it's parking or septic and, yeah.
we have, this can always be discussed, one of the purposes of zoning is to sequester uses so that you have residential uses, you know, in certain areas, and then business, commercial, you know, those kinds of uses elsewhere. I think that, I believe that the residents of the central residential district would be very alarmed if they thought that down the street or anywhere there could be a restaurant.
If I can ask a couple of questions, are all of the properties that you mentioned initially, Martha, are those within the historic district?
Yeah.
Okay.
They
because then,
really are
Yeah. The historic
central
district
part.
goes up High Street
So-
and down Main Street.
So you basically, at this point, the way things are, you're talking about, you would be talking about renovations of existing buildings, not new construction.
Right.
That's right.
So,
New
I think
inside
that makes it-
construction, probably very likely, but
right.
the exterior would be upgraded in appropriate materials and appropriate colors potentially, according to the historic commission, but it sounds to me like the footprints wouldn't change.
Well, this all depends on code, if they have to add a ramp, you know, a handicap ramp, if they have to add, you know, depending on what code requires, you know, all of the, you know, alarm systems and.
Yeah, but those are all internal things, except the handicap accessibility, and they're exempt. You can't.
Would a change kick in some of those green energy standards that, so therefore things have to be insulated, windows have to be changed? Does it depends on how much money,
It depends on the amount of money that's spent on the renovation.
Right.
But then if it's in the historic district or on the register, then they can get exemptions from those requirements. I'm not sure why anybody would, if it's not affecting the outside of the structure, why they would want to get an exemption from the energy.
taking
but-
out original windows and doors and those kinds of things are, as you know,
Yeah.
those are important to us, so, you know.
It's also very important, I think, to speak with the property owners.
Yes.
Now, I know that you've spoken with a couple of the private property owners,
Yes.
but we're talking about two families who have lived here. In the case of the Ballsmas, they've lived here for generations. And that home before zoning was, I think, a tea house or something. It was a
It was
commercial
a
property.
tavern.
I think it was a tavern, maybe it
Yeah,
was.
maybe it was a
something like
tavern,
that,
there was
yeah.
some, but when the Ballsmas purchased it, it became the family home. And then zoning went into effect and became part of a residential district. But I think often property owners are very worried about what this means. They may be reassured that, okay, this is a great move because, you know, if you decide to sell your home, it could be more valuable. But if the property owners feel that they're being threatened in some way
Yeah,
by
no, we
this,
certainly don't want that.
I think it's really critical that there be discussions with people who actually own those properties to let them know what the thinking is.
Yeah, I'd like to share an observation and share and also a thought. The observation is that this now seems impossible to do properly and effectively between now and May. I mean,
Bingo.
there's a fool's errand. So I'm now saying maybe to 2021, but we don't know.
Well, I
Yeah.
think the planning board would certainly be willing to start looking at language. We would have to have very close discussions with the historical commission about signage. And I think if we have a sense of the magnitude, you know, of
Right.
this, then, so you know, you can keep your placeholders, you know,
Yeah.
but there's,
Let me
Yeah,
ask
please,
though, I mean, because in the business village and in our zoning code, restaurants are allowed by special permit.
right.
So why go through this trouble?
In the business village, but not in central residential?
Right, but within the, so are we saying some of the, okay, so this
BV
actually.
is that little.
Yeah, right, just, so this is,
Nothing in
Because
the common is in a
fortunately-
business village.
This
Okay.
little thing right there.
got it.
And we're talking about, this is the common right
Right,
here, so
exactly.
it'd be these lots here.
And again, you don't
Point
want
out
to
the
just.
4 lots we're talking about.
The lots that I see now issue with is so-called, I think it's Lot 1, which the Emerson Center is on. The Emerson Field is Lot 2, not thinking of that, just stay away from that. Looking at the Topsfield Commons here, the Lopez House here, the Rolsmas House here, this is the church, this is the steeple, this is this is the town hall right here, and the library over here. the purpose is not necessarily to, we're not gonna, you know, change the uses of the town-owned buildings. I don't think the church is certainly in the immediately foreseeable future is gonna make any changes. But it would be possible for them, if they so chose, to run a restaurant, if they found somebody who it was a good investment. They would be allowed to do that, because currently I understand that if they sold that, it technically is a single-family house.
That's what I understand too.
Which kind of, I'm not saying they want to sell, but even from a lease point of view, it'd be the question as to whether they would be potentially allowed to do that. I do not know that there's any interest on their part for that kind of use. I've talked with them about the idea there might be some conversation around a zoning change for Topsfield Common, but it is just preliminary discussion, and I've not talked with them about what that would mean to them. It's more letting them go so they can kind of begin thinking that maybe there'll be some conversation, and just said they'll stay tuned.
Well, the reason that I raised the question about the abutting lots, the highway garage is not in the business village.
That's the other question.
The
Yep.
the box top consignment is not in the business village. There is a parcel of land that is essentially landlocked, that abuts the highway garage and abuts the box top, and that's not in the business village. So if we're looking at potentially capturing.
That's this area right here.
Yeah, right there.
Yep.
If there's interest in expanding the business village per se, with all of its uses and its everything, okay, there are adjoining lots that I think we should take a look at. Beyond that, there aren't any empty lots, but there are non-conforming properties going over to Prospect Street, South Main Street. We did try at one point, many years ago, to capture some of those properties in the business village, but we're not very successful. In fact, town meeting that year wouldn't let us move the property line 50 feet. I mean,
The property owners are pretty vocal, I remember.
oh,
And that's one of those things that, exactly what you were talking about, from Grove Street to Prospect Street, those ones on the couple of houses that are multifamily. All right, and then there's the newly renovated 9-11
Right.
South Main. Those are ones that I wanted to speak to, because you have Central Residential District on one side of the street and Business Village on the other side of the street. And signage is a huge issue with them, because they can have a 6 square foot sign on the right-hand side of the street, and you know, and a huge sign on the other side of the street. So it's not even, you know, it's not compatible with that, and it just doesn't make sense to have, to me personally, to have those 2 or 3 lots on that right side that aren't included. It's like a notch out of the Business Village District.
right.
So
Well,
I know you tried that. You
Yeah, we
tried that
tried.
several years ago, and I'm not sure what the objection is, because those are business properties. They've been business properties for years. It's not like the use is going to change. So.
And they are mixed use, and there are the 3 condos, you know, that also are typical of uses in the
Right.
business village. But I think that we could do a better job of explaining to the public why we would want to make these changes in the areas around the business village. I think when we tried it before, you know, it's change and it's favoritism, and it's, you know, look at what they're gonna do. They're gonna destroy our downtown, and so, but that, I think it would be useful if there are any plans for the old highway garage, or we know there's land up there And we know it perks, we've dug holes there many times, you know? We're familiar with the conditions. I think that this is a pretty serious thing to take a look at, to see whether this would provide opportunity for growth, you know, opportunity for new structures.
That piece near the box stop, I've had some inquiries over the years about that particular piece of property for veterans housing. and,
Come on, in behind the box top.
Yeah.
Yeah. The, one of the things that, when this all started and began looking at this, downtown revitalization was a code word for fix the shopping center. And
That's where it started.
one of the things that I certainly have been trying to champion is the notion that we should look at all of downtown. And we may do improvements to surround the Flaunt property. And I really love the idea of, if we did sort of increase the business concentration up near the bake shop, School Street, EPW and so on and so forth, it kind of moves the center of town a little bit further north. Ultimately, something's going to happen with the shopping center, and it will create a larger area for more development. That is definitely something that, if I had a choice between really fostering that and trying to make changes here, I'd focus on that. This looked like it was going to be easier. Right now I realize it isn't, so.
Yeah. Well, I think we can take a look at it and see.
Well, I don't want to let it go.
You know,
I
It
mean,
could
we
be
don't
all
wanna-
part of the
Breaks it off.
vision.
Right,
possibly.
that, you know,
Exactly.
how much, where is the language, you know, how do we manage the language?
Yeah.
How do we protect the historical commission's, you know, role in all of this?
Mhm.
You know, that's.
And that's important.
Yeah, but if you want to add other lots, then that's easily done. That's a simple warrant article to add to the business village, you know, lot X on map Y. I mean, so that, I think, is something.
Do you have a list of those lots? Have you, as a board, thought about that? I'm wondering whether that's,
There's no list, I don't think, that we've ever created.
I wanted some
The
suggestions.
list is probably
of
long
candidates.
gone now. I mean, we did have a list at one point, but it's what Glenn's been talking about.
Yeah.
It goes over to Prospect Street,
Right.
and do we cross Prospect Street?
No, it's not, I don't believe, there's, I'm not sure. I
It's the
think it's
dentist's
a
office.
single-family house on the other side of it, on the other side of Prospect Street.
The
on the town.
dentist
No, it's
is,
a dentist,
Um,
professional.
But a dentist is allowed even in the central residential
The
there.
dentist's
you
office.
know.
Business, home.
Yeah, yeah.
this
But
is,
it's-
yeah, that's fine. And this is the area that currently is now considered IRA, is it, this one right here, or central residential? I think it's central residential is right this area, but if this became business village, as it's currently
You have to
being
move
used.
the lot line from the midpoint of the B&M Railway tracks, because that was where the business village ended.
Yeah,
So you move it from there, to crossing Gale Street, Grove Street,
Yeah.
and then to include the condos and the newly renovated building.
Three units, three buildings, essentially.
Essentially. So there's that, and Glenn, you may have ideas about other lots.
What about, is 7 Grove Street in the business village or central residential?
Central resident, 7, well, oh, the
7,
the station?
Brian, yeah.
Part of it is in the business village. It's one of those lot
Looks like
lines.
part of it is.
So, you know, that's one of those things that could be easily corrected if you're making changes down there like that.
That's right.
So, I mean, it doesn't make sense to have half the building in one zone and half the building in another zone. It's like 413 Boston Street where you have, it's in 3 zones.
3 of them come together. Okay, so this is something, are you interested in doing something like that?
yeah, I think that would be a great thing to at least take a first look at all the potential candidates and then look at what the challenges, advantages, and value of those would be. And we can make an assessment, whether it's this year or next year. The most important thing is we as a board are committed to downtown revitalization. we're not trying to go fast, we're trying to go smart, and we're also trying to build the downtown in a style and a feeling that will reflect what we see Topsfield as being. So I oftentimes think it's sort of mid-19th century vernacular. Ben Nutter probably could give me 6 different architecture types.
I think it would be good to create the list, you know, we'll have Glenn contribute what he thinks would be really helpful. I'd be hesitant to go down Grove Street more, but there were a whole bunch of non-conforming properties there on.
I mean, you can split it at the, you know, as you're going into Grove Street from Maine, you can make the zone come down the station side and then across, you know what I mean? So you're not involving any other residential properties.
The old Grange building, Whimsy House, is half in the business village and half, you know, in the residential. You know, so there's another one that the lot is divided in half. And
So if we can go back to the old, there's the town-owned property behind the fire station, the old highway barn and stuff. Those have been basically empty as far as I know for as long as I've been here. So.
You mean the highway garage is empty? Is that
So
what you're saying?
it's got junk, stuff
It's
stored
full
in
of
it.
junk.
It's not empty.
It's not junk, it's
Yeah,
I understand what you're
Yeah,
saying.
you know what I'm
stuff
saying.
currently
It's-
not
it
in
has-
the-
Full of
it has-
assets.
It's not empty.
Yeah.
It's not
Oh,
used.
Antiquated assets, how's that?
Well, certainly,
But it-
this whole concept is gonna involve that piece of property and that building. It'd be silly to try to do something like we're talking about here and not do something
And would
with
that be
everything that we
expanding?
own that we can do something with.
Would that be expanding the business village district to include that area?
well, I'm
Because you would
thinking,
have, you talked
This-
about a restaurant or something like that, there'd be plenty
This
of
is
parking.
School Street right here. I know the owner of this area here, the Curiozzi family, potentially interested in participating if it's clear it's going to really turn into something. So this and this became potentially in play, this by zoning, this by the owner's decision. There are properties on this side, you can just go along and see behind the bake shop, that are underutilized. There are buildings there, but they could be, if there was the economic incentive, which is what town revitalization is intended to do, that could be restructured in such a way, it'd almost be like a cross piece to where Main Street comes down. And my belief is that there's room for another probably 20 businesses, and we've talked about housing. A lot of people in town would like to see some housing. So if there was affordable housing, elderly housing, not lots of it, not tons of it, big stacks, but maybe second floors, depending upon with the elevator laws, whether we decide to adjust things and allow 3 stories to make it more affordable. There's all kinds of potentials that would bring people living downtown, which is a positive, particularly for older seniors who don't have cars. I think of Janet Brown. She walks around Great Hill all the time, and the COA bus comes and picks her up. You know, she's out there all the time. And I don't want her to move for being our neighbor, but she's an example of the kind of person who with COA nearby and potentially the kinds of stores, you know, I'd like to see a small sort of a Danvers Fresh Market kind of a place that sells simple groceries. Yes, they're more expensive, but they're fresh and they're local. Those kinds of things start to really change the use of downtown, put people living to where businesses will be, and then what the town can do in addition to seeking state and federal support. And we've already, for instance, I know a lot of people say, oh, DPW yard is probably filled with motor oil and everything else. I was surprised when I talked to people from the state and said, oh, there's 7-figure money to mitigate that kind of pollution. So we pay for everything around town hall. We might not have to pay for all of that, or somebody who's going to develop. But I think all of that could lead in a direction. We're convinced, and Lynn and I have been working on this with MAPC now for, gosh, over a year, isn't it? And the feeling very strongly is that if we could just kind of get started in get to that critical mass. Topsfield has the wonderful advantage that we're seeing as being an undeveloped opportunity, meaning to revitalize, not to build massive new stuff. And that we've not been going to the state with our hands out. So now that we're doing things and starting strategic planning and so on, the feeling is, oh, they're ready, they're paying attention. We've had the Secretary of Economic Development out here and engaged many people from the state in seeing what the potential could be. And I think that we should take advantage of that. Is the one single most common desire of a majority of the people in Topsfield, as far as I can tell. And we gotta be careful, which is why we wanna be thoughtful and so on.
Don't wanna kill the golden goose.
No, we don't wanna kill the golden goose, but I'll stay away from the metaphors on that. But at the same time, I think we have some opportunities to create some things that we know could be. I often have said we don't want to create a place that's sort of ticky-tacky, too precious. You know, it's sort of all sort of brand new. It looks as if Restoration Hardware made this a project of theirs. But I think there are a lot of things that we can do, and there's a lot of support from the state. And we now have their attention. And one of the big things that has evolved now that the select board is looking at leading this effort, which means we're now seen as in support of what private individuals and businesses and investors have said they want to be able to do. And that opens us up to state funding. Private people can't go get state funding, but when the town is there, suddenly we have their attention. So we're at an incredibly vital point. I really like this idea of seeing if we could start the process, maybe it's 2021, but looking at what could be done. And one thing I know, we can create an event to engage the town in looking at the options and getting feedback. We can do several things, and I agree totally.
Okay, well, I think an
We know
action
what you're saying.
item that we need to come up with a list of, you know, those
Yep.
properties that could be included. Kevin?
I don't keep going with
No,
that.
that's the first
Yep.
step, and that actually, once we talk with people and the board gets a chance to look at it, everyone talks about this, there will have to be public discussion.
Of course.
This you can manage, you know, around adding a few lots.
Yep.
You know, that can be done, I believe. Then, you know, that's really not difficult. I am going to need David's help. Because I was investigating the property, the highway garage property, and you'd be very interested to know that Nehemiah Cleveland sold the property to the Topsfield Academy in 18-something. And I suspect that the property that the fire station is on may not have been a part of that because of some of the descriptions. And you know, I went to the book, you know, the index book.
So it'd be the basement of the Essex Registry.
And the problem is, I've got the right book, but it's folded over and you can't read the page number. So I have been pouring through all of this book trying to locate Nehemiah Cleveland's description of the property. Okay.
Found this online.
Yeah, Salem deeds. But as I say, it's the index book. It's just, you know, folded over. So, you're an expert at figuring this stuff out.
Martha, you had mentioned it, and we don't want to rush, we don't. But it sounds from your description that even following the process that you laid out, which is great to get all involvement and make sure everybody's voice is heard, is this doable by town meeting?
I think just expanding the business village with additional lots, because we're not dealing with uses, we're not dealing with density and dimensional at this point. We're not gonna be tinkering with the sign bylaw or anything. It's just the establishment of the district, which would mean adding certain blocks to the district. So that can be done with public input and all. It's just the other one requires, you know, what, 4 different bylaws and whatever. Now, I notice that there's a lot of discussion about modifying existing zoning regulations, that some of this, we really need to solve the parking issue before we eliminate parking requirements. You know, I mean, we really do need to do that. The lot size, I've investigated. I think the smallest lot in the business village is maybe 1,700 square feet. You know, it's this teeny, it's Gills.
Yeah.
Oh, Gills, okay.
Grocery. And then Cargill's, you know,
Yeah.
comes next. So we're going to have to take a very close look at what kind of lot size we'd be looking at. And I understand that the Board of Health did a beautiful report for you. Is there some way we can get a hold of that?
Yes,
I don't know about
there is. This is the discussion, we've been sort of saying, oh, we're gonna probably need to do a sewer system. We ought to see if we can get a feasibility, a grant for a feasibility study. And what ended up happening is Wendy came in and went over the current capacities and the rules, regulations around sewage and so on. And at this time, apparently, contrary to a lot of people's belief, there's a very high, if not total, compliance with existing laws and capabilities. Now, the question then is, what if two things can happen? The laws can become stricter, different things get measured, and there could be increased desire. For instance, if you are doing a 25-seat restaurant, you need a certain capacity. If you want to do a 50-seat, then you have to have more capacity, which might or might not be able to be available. I wanted to, first is, I want to recognize Kevin, but I also want to just lead in by saying, Kevin, having come from Beverly, was, as Chief of Staff for Mayor Cahill, was point person for the Rantoul Street renovation, which is considered by many to be a huge benefit. And that happened quickly and smartly and has been appreciated by all. So, and he's getting an award for it soon too. So let me pass to you, Kim.
Thank you. We talked about capacity. I mean, the infrastructure would exist currently for growth. Talk about, you know, if you had something happened at the Topsfield Common business area there. I actually asked Greg Crom from the water department to pull some numbers on that as well. Last week he gave me an assessment of how much growth capacity we have. We have a 12-inch main that goes through there, which does have some capacity for growth as well. We won't get into the details and numbers at this point in the game, but the two things we're talking about, Wendy and with the Board of Health and the septic, coupled with the water, some of the key elements we got to make sure we're considering, which is already being done, but just wanted to mention that as well. This is a great conversation. First and foremost, it's the right conversation, and I'm really glad to be here and listening. I just had a couple sort of questions and thoughts. Has there been any conversation about a master plan process for the town, or more specifically, a planning process around the downtown? We're talking about multiple districts, for example, and expansion and maybe contraction, and what type of height restrictions make sense today. And I asked that question because talking about signaling for private investment potentially, any community that takes on a master plan process or a downtown zoning process of sorts is a trigger to the public sector, that there's some tension, possibly some change, and it will be something that could generate some interest just on the surface. People pay attention. And then secondly to that, once and if the zoning change does take place, that is what, you know, we talk about possibly what people who already own property might do. When that zoning change happens, that sometimes sees that's an opportunity for transition where somebody who does have the wherewithal, like we talked about, could come in and do something. So the conversation we're having right now is very exciting for the downtown, for the town of Topsfield. So I guess my question is on that. You know, I know we're sort of identifying next steps sort of internally within our own processes. Has there been any conversation historically or previously on having somebody come in? And I asked that because we talked about the public component as well, which Martha nailed the nail on the head. You have to have that communication, thorough communication, to do it right. A lot of times a consultant comes in, they have that sort of playbook on how to do that expedited, look at all the different angles and an outside perspective as well. So I just kind of put it out there as an idea as well of a possible path.
Well, we did, with the state assistance, we did a 418 community development plan. And because we had already met the water requirements and the open space plan, you may remember this, we were able to hire RKG, and they did economic development and housing with a whole series of recommendations.
What year was that, Martha?
2004, 5, something like that.
Okay.
We can go back and look. It is available digitally, and, I can forward it to
I have.
anyone who would like
Yeah.
to put it up on the website. But we followed the recommendation. Actually, RKG spent a great deal of time with the master planning committee, and we drew on all of our boards and committees and private citizens. It was a very, very extensive committee, and they came up with, I think, very good recommendations that over the following years we adopted. For instance, restaurants in all business districts. I mean, it used to be only one business district, you could have a restaurant, and a whole bunch of, different things, expanding things. There were more ambitious ideas that they came up with that people would have nothing to do with, and so it's always been very conservative, change comes hard. So that's where we were and are with planning, a master plan. There was a whole real master plan, I hear, 1966, and it's probably still in a drawer somewhere.
I have it.
You have it?
I found it.
Don't lose it.
But just so everyone understands, it's a little tricky now because Topsfield is essentially built out. And that unlike the 1966 era, where people could designate, okay, this is commercial and this would be developed residentially and so on, we now find ourselves essentially built out, and change that residents feel threatens their neighborhood or their way of life or whatever can be alarming and difficult. So it's a lot more difficult, I think, to do one of these great big master plans than it was back in the day.
But that master plan was very significant because it was the stuff that established the business village, the central residential, the IRA, the ORA. I mean, all of that basic concept and layout of the town was established, and it's really what's done a lot to make Topsfield what it is today. The great concept that you got this and then this and then this, based on, at that point, what was available, the central residential district, this half acre and this, what I call the flats of Topsfield, a beautiful flat land and whatever else, very close to the village. I mean, these are well thought out and well done. And we're enjoying it for many, many, many years.
And all of that was created in the adoption of zoning.
Yes.
And then they came back and revised it. The IRA got broken into the ORA, which were the larger lots. And this was all part of the establishment of districts in Topsfield. But in any case, we can take a look at a lot of this, to see what could potentially be useful. But there's a lot here that I think, and this isn't being critical at all, they've provided us with a whole bunch of strategies for building housing, for creating housing. And one of them is you do an in-law, you do an accessory apartment on a single family home. And now I know that's a very popular thing that's being promoted now, but there's only one single family home in the business village, number one. And number two, it could be turned into 4 apartments right now under our existing laws. So we need to go through and see which of these actually could be applied and would be helpful, and which of these really are just kind of extraneous and wouldn't really accomplish anything.
Martha, that particular one was actually more applicable to the entire town. It wasn't just an issue
Right.
for the downtown.
Right, well, indeed. I don't know that we want to go there. I don't think we want to go there.
I know, it was addressing the issue that a lot of people in town can't stay in town. They're being priced out with the taxes and the general increases. So it was a way for them to have another revenue source to help people who have lived in town for decades to stay in town. That's what that was.
Well, again, that's a community discussion for people to have. When we do the accessory in-law apartments, more often than not, neighbors show up objecting because they're afraid that there'll be rental apartments, that they'll get turned into some kind of rental thing. And so we explained always very nicely that no, you know, this is family and that, you know, and that this is allowing people to stay together as families, and then people are fine with it. But a lot of this is long-term discussion.
No question.
That's not
No
something we can do
question.
before term meeting.
Lynn, there used to be a thing in the zoning bylaw that allowed you to convert to a two-family, as long as there were no changes, after some date specific, and I think it was January of '64 or something like that. And so that you could convert a single family to a two-family basically with no exterior changes.
And that's still on the books, is that?
No, they did away with that. I don't know if they did away with that before they put in the accessory unit bylaw.
I think it was
or-
gone.
I think it was.
By the time I got involved in it, there was one effort to do an in-law apartment that failed dreadfully.
Okay.
And then we came back the next year with a more controlled version of it, and then again pointed out that this is intergenerational living, you know, that this is allowing people to stay in their homes, you know, with caretakers or whatever it might be. And so then that was bad.
And one thing that I know for a fact that people don't understand is that when you have an in-law apartment, a true in-law apartment is, it may be in a garage, but you have, one water meter, one electric meter, one septic system, one, it's all within the main unit, or under the blanket of the main unit. If you have a two-family, you have to have, you have to have separate water, you have to have separate power, separate heat source and all that. There's a lot that goes into a two-family versus like an in-law apartment. There's means of egress. You can have an in-law apartment. One of the means of egress can go through the main house, but you can't do that if you have a rental unit. So there's a lot of difference.
I'd like to get back to business. Boyd, you wanted to say something here?
I'd just like to say something. The conversation is wonderful, and we've got to start somewhere, okay? This whole movement came out of the fact that the Board of Selectmen was being impinged on by people all over town to do something with the shopping center. We've been listening to that for 10 or 12 or 15 years now, and we finally got together and decided, let's get started with this. So Mark Lyons appointed John Spencer and Lynn Bermudez as the spearhead to approach state organizations, to work with business owners in the area and try to figure out what could be done. And the thing is expanded a little bit. And we're talking about a lot of things here today that we're not going to have to address for. I could be in a box before you have to put some of those things in force. But the fact of the matter is, it's important that we started that conversation now, and I can tell you that if you take a look at that list, there are things on there that certainly the Board of Selectmen can't handle. And we need the planning board and the ZBA as part of the team that can put, and the building inspector, to put that together as part of the team to understand what we can do, what we can't do, and what we should do, okay? I'd like you, has everybody got a copy of that, by the way, did every?
This is
online.
up online.
It's online,
It's
okay?
online.
It's online.
And it's a very good list, but it's, it's not a list that we've gotta do everything on there. These are suggestions of things that we ought to consider.
And that's what I was saying, that we need to take a look at all of these things, see what might be applicable, what might,
Yeah.
what might not be applicable. I see you've got the planning board roped into a great many of these things.
Why not?
And I will say that in some cases, we do not have the technical expertise to be able to deal with a town septic system or a downtown sewer system.
Without doubt, yeah.
If we get a grant to probably
Yeah,
work with.
just so you know, I mean, we've
Yeah, no,
already
this-
looked at that, last time around, we did check into it, and, but could go only so far because we are not,
Yeah.
sewer
I
specialists.
understand.
So there's a lot that you've got us signed up for here.
Who authored that?
That was the MAPC working with the working group. So we felt we wanted to make sure we didn't leave anybody out, that people had the option of saying, that's not our bailiwick, we're going to pull out of it. And rather over-include than under-include.
Well, just so you know, I mean, there's a lot of stuff here that you've got us signed up for, but
It's
I'm
wired.
a little bit concerned.
To that point too, I know we talked just briefly, I mentioned the master plan, bringing somebody else in. We did go through that process in Beverly as I was leaving. We had great successes with going out in the community and the public engagement component of it, and listening to them to help form what types of changes, if any, existed. I'd personally like to go through this with you as well, understanding with the board, to understand what's being allocated where, and whatever help I can offer is, I'd like to put that on the table.
Well, they've got you down on every one of the categories.
Oh, who's taking minutes?
It's a watermark in every page.
Yeah,
To be clear, that list is a starting point.
Exactly.
It's not comprehensive,
Yeah.
there are things gonna be added, there are things gonna be taken off. There are gonna be additional subcommittees assigned to all of these things to make sure that they're vetted out and what are the proper next steps and timetables, et cetera.
As I visualize this thing, this is a huge, huge program for the town of Topsfield. And we want to try to do it, we can't get flopped to do anything. So I think what John has done, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think they're trying to do enough around him to create pressure to make him feel like he's got to do something, okay?
Just speaking in Mr. Flump's favor, he has been cooperative with us. We've met with him numerous times, and there are changes that are being designed right now that people will hear about soon, where he has given his cooperation to go ahead and use his land for this purpose.
Cool.
That is being proposed.
And I would also say that I purposely broached it as kind of a quick hit rather than asking for an immediate reaction, but I have proposed to him that he perhaps consider whether there'd be a way that we could buy the parking lot, lease it on a long-term lease, or get a long-term easement in exchange for taking over design, maintenance, plowing, and so on and so forth. And figuring in the worst case, we can put a row of cedars between them. But I mean, I think that there are potential solutions. We're working towards that, and as I've said to many people, there are still quite a few carrots in our bag before we go reaching for the stick.
We had, as part of a study that was done concurrently with the strategic plan development with MAPC, we received a grant to conduct a parking study. And they came in to assess, and that's something we can talk about later, Martha, to assess exactly what is our utilization of parking and what time of day is it heaviest and where might we need some support, et cetera. And one of the things that they looked at was the concept that John mentioned about is sharing, parking sharing, and then looking out to whether it be St. Rose, who has a parking lot that is underutilized a good part of the week, except when they have classes and masses, and the shopping center, and seeing if there could be some joint agreement made. So there's a whole series of recommendations that came out of the parking study that were incorporated in there as well.
Well, I think both the parking study and anything about downtown septic These are the big infrastructure issues that really need to be considered and resolved before we start totally changing everything.
Absolutely.
So, do you want to say anything? Okay.
I wanted to, maybe so we don't stay here, because we can talk about this forever, but just sort of say, I hear two things that are action items. The one I thought was going to be top of the list was to look more deeply into what it would take to create a common district that would have a very limited number of uses. I think that still sounds good. It's clearly a far more complex thing.